Chapter 5. Psychological Interpretations of Basic Logical Principles. 25. The law of contradiction. In the psychologistic interpretation of Mill and Spencer we have said above that a consistent carrying out of the notion of logical laws as laws which concern mental facts, must lead to essential misinterpretations of these laws. The logic which at present prevails has, however, generally been afraid of consistency, on this point as on all others. One might almost say that it is only inconsistency that keeps psychologism alive. To think it out to the end, is already to have given it up, unless extreme empiricism affords an example of the greatly superior strength of ingrained prejudices to the most certain deliverances of insight. What we have said in objection to this logical position, that on it logical truths must lose their a priori guarantee, and their wholly exact, purely conceptual character, and must become more or less vague probabilities resting on experience and induction, concerned with matters of fact in the mental life of man, all this, if we ignore its emphasis on vagueness, is what empiricism expressly teaches. We cannot attempt an exhaustive criticism of such an epistemological trend. But we have a special interest in the psychological interpretation of logical laws which this school has fostered, and whose bemusement has also spread beyond its borders. 1 John Stuart Mill, too, it is well known, held the principle of contradiction to be one of our earliest and most familiar generalizations from experience. Its original foundation is taken by Mill to be the fact that belief and disbelief are two different mental states which exclude one another. This we know, we follow him verbatim, by the simplest observation of our own minds. And if we carry our observation outwards, we find that here too light and darkness, sound and silence, equality and inequality, precedence and subsequence, succession and simultaneity, any positive phenomenon, in short, and its negation, are distinct phenomena, in a relation of extreme contrariety, and that one of them is always absent when the other is present. I consider the axiom in question, he remarks, to be a generalization from all these facts. Where the fundamental principles of his empiricistic prejudices are at stake, all the gods seem to abandon Mill's otherwise keen intelligence. Only one thing is hard to understand, how such a doctrine could have seemed persuasive. It is obviously false to say that the principle that two contradictory propositions cannot both be true, and in this sense exclude one another, is a generalization from the facts cited, that light and darkness, sound and silence etc., exclude one another, since these are not contradictory propositions at all. It is quite unintelligible how Mill thinks he can connect these supposed facts of experience with the logical law. In vain one looks for light among Mill's parallel statements in his polemic against Hamilton. Here he approvingly quotes the absolutely constant law on which the like-minded Spencer bases the logical principle in question, i.e. that the appearance of any positive mode of consciousness cannot occur without excluding a correlative negative mode, and that the negative mode cannot occur without excluding the correlative positive mode. 3 Who can fail to see that this law is a pure tautology, since mutual exclusion enters into the definition of the correlative terms positive and negative. Phenomenon. The law of contradiction, on the other hand, is by no means tautologous. We do not define contradictory propositions by saying that they are mutually exclusive, and, even if the principle in question makes them so, the converse does not hold. Not every pair of mutually exclusive propositions is a contradictory pair, proof enough that one should not confuse our principle with the above tautology. Mill himself does not want it to be taken as a tautology, since he locates its original source in an induction from experience. The empirical sense of the principle is not illuminated by Mill's barely intelligible references to non-coexistences among the data of outer experience. More light is shed by other statements where Mill asks if the three basic logical laws should be treated as inherent necessities of thought, an original part of our mental constitution, laws of our thoughts by the native structure of our minds, or if they are not perhaps laws of thought merely because we perceive them to be universally true of observed phenomena, an issue on which Mill does not, however, care to pronounce positively. We read in regard to these laws, they may or may not be capable of alteration by experience, but the conditions of our existence deny to us the experience which would be required to alter them. Any assertion, therefore, which conflicts with one of these laws, any proposition, for instance, which asserts a contradiction, though it were on a subject wholly removed from the sphere of our experience, is to us unbelievable. The belief in such a proposition is, in the present constitution of nature, impossible as a mental fact. 4 We conclude from this passage that the inconsistency expressed in the law of contradiction, the impossibility of the joint truth of contradictory propositions, is seen by Mill as an incompatibility of such propositions in our belief. In other words, he substitutes for the impossibility that the propositions should both be true, the real incompatibility of the corresponding acts of judgment. This also fits in with Mill's repeated assertion that acts of belief are the only things that can properly be called true and false. The principle must be interpreted as saying, two contradictorily opposed acts of belief cannot coexist. 26 Mill's psychological interpretation of the principle yields no law, but a wholly vague, and scientifically unproven, empirical proposition. All sorts of difficulties now rise up. The expression of the principle is certainly incomplete. What are the circumstances, we should have to ask, in which opposed acts of belief cannot coexist? Opposed judgments can very well coexist in different individuals. We ought therefore to be more precise, and at the same time to set forth the sense of real coexistence, by saying that in the same individual, or rather in the same consciousness, contradictory acts of belief are incapable of lasting for any time, however short. But is this really a law? Can we really utter it with such boundless generality? What are the psychological inductions which justify its acceptance? May there not have been people, and may there not still be people who, deceived by fallacies, contrive at times to believe contradictories together? Has the occurrence of contradictions, even quite obvious ones, been scientifically investigated in the case of the insane? What happens in hypnotic states, in delirium tremens etc.? Does this law also hold for animals? Possibly the empiricist will escape these objections by suitably qualifying his law, for example by saying that it only applies to normal individuals of the genus Homo, having a normal mental constitution. It is sufficient to raise the insidious question of the exact definition of the concepts normal individual and normal mental constitution to see how imprecise and complex the content of the law, as now stated, has become. We need not carry our discussions further, though the law's reference to time might, for example, provide occasion to do so. They are enough to leave us with the amazing result that our familiar principle of contradiction, which has always counted as a wholly exact, self-evident, exceptionless law, is the very paradigm of a grossly imprecise, unscientific proposition, that can only be raised to the status of a plausible surmise after its seemingly exact content has been rendered quite vague by numerous corrections. This must indeed be the truth if empiricism is right in regarding the incompatibility mentioned in the principle, as a real non-coexistence of contradictory acts of judgment, if the principle is itself to be treated as a generalization of empirical psychology. Mill's brand of empiricism does not even think of scientifically delimiting and proving his extraordinarily imprecise proposition, the immediate outcome of his psychological interpretation. It takes it in all its native imprecision, as being one of the earliest and most familiar generalizations from experience, i.e. as being what a rough generalization from pre-scientific experience might be expected to be. At the very point where the last foundations of all science are in question, we have recourse to this naive empiricism with its blind mechanism of association. Persuasions begotten without insight, through psychological mechanisms, and with no better justification than widespread prejudices, whose origin rules out all fixed, tenable delimitation, and which, taken literally, include manifest falsehood. These are to be the last grounds on which all strictly scientific knowledge is to be justified. The matter need not be pursued further. It is, however, important to touch on the basic mistake in the doctrines we are attacking, by asking whether our proposition about acts of belief can, in any formulation, be the proposition we make use of in logic. It tells us, in certain subjective circumstances X, unfortunately not further investigated nor capable of being completely specified, two acts of belief having a yes-no opposition cannot coexist in the same consciousness. Is this what logicians really mean when they say that two contradictory propositions cannot both be true? We need only look at the cases where our law serves to regulate our activities of judging to see that it means something quite different. In its normative form it plainly says one thing and one thing only, whatever pairs of opposed acts of belief we may select, whether belonging to one or to several individuals, whether coexisting in the same time stretch or separated by time stretches, it holds strictly, and absolutely, and without exception, that not both members of each such pair are correct, or in accordance with truth. I do not think that even an empiricist could question the validity of this norm. Logic at all events, when it speaks of laws of thought, is concerned only with these second, logical laws, not with our former vague laws of psychology, whose content is totally different, and has not even yet been formulated. Appendix to the last two sections on certain basic defects of empiricism. Since empiricism and psychologism are intimately linked, we may perhaps permit ourselves a small digression to expose the basic errors of empiricism. Extreme empiricism is as absurd a theory of knowledge as extreme skepticism. It destroys the possibility of the rational justification of mediate knowledge, and so destroys its own possibility as a scientifically proven theory. 5. It admits that there is mediate knowledge, the product of various validating connections, and it does not reject principles of validation. It not only admits that there is a logic, but itself helps to construct it. If, however, all proof rests on principles governing its procedure, and if its final justification involves an appeal to such principles, then we should either be involved in a circle or in an infinite regress if the principles of proof themselves required further proof, in a circle if the principles of proof used to justify the principles of proof were the same as the latter, in a regress if both sets of principles were repeatedly different. Plainly, therefore, the demand for a fundamental justification of all mediate knowledge can only have a sense if we can both see and know certain ultimate principles on which all proof in the last instance rests. All principles which justify possible proofs must therefore be deductively inferable from certain last, immediately evident principles, so that even the principles of the deduction in question all themselves occur among such principles. Extreme empiricism, therefore, since it only basically puts full trust in singular judgments of experience, a quite uncritical trust since it ignores the difficulties which so richly attend upon such singular judgments, it so abandons all hope of rationally justifying mediate knowledge. It will not acknowledge as immediate insights, and as given truths, the ultimate principles on which the justification of mediate knowledge depends. It thinks it can do better by deriving them from experience and induction, i.e. by justifying them immediately. But if one asks what principles justify such a derivation, empiricism, forbidden to appeal to immediately evident universal principles, appeals rather to naive, uncritical, everyday experience, which it thinks to dignify more highly by explaining it psychologically in Humean fashion. It therefore fails to see that, having no insightful justification for our mediate assumptions, no justification, therefore, for the relevant proof procedures from the immediately evident general principles that they follow, its whole psychological theory, its whole mediately known doctrine of empiricism, is without rational foundation, is, in fact, a mere assumption, no more than a common prejudice. It is extraordinary that empiricism should give a readier credence to a theory so loaded with absurdities than to the fundamental trivialities of logic and arithmetic. As a genuine psychologism, it tends always to confuse the psychological origin of certain general judgments in experience, on account of some supposed naturalness, with the justification of the same judgments. It is worth noting that it goes no better with Hume's moderate empiricism which, despite bouts of psychologistic confusion, still tries to keep for the pure spheres of logic and mathematics, an a priori justification, and only surrenders the factual sciences to experience. Such an epistemological standpoint can likewise be shown up as untenable, even absurd, for a reason similar to that brought by us against extreme empiricism. Mediate judgments of fact, we may compress the sense of Hume's theory into this phrase, never permit of rational justification, only of psychological explanation. One need then but ask how this applies to the rational justification of the psychological judgments, about custom, association of ideas etc., on which the theory itself rests, and the factual arguments that it itself employs. One then at once sees the self-evident conflict between the sense of the proposition that the theory seeks to prove, and the sense of the deductions that it employs to prove it. The psychological premises of the theory are themselves mediate judgments of fact, and therefore lack all rational justification in the sense of the thesis to be established. In other words, the correctness of the theory presupposes the irrationality of its premises, the correctness of the premise is the irrationality of the theory, or thesis. Hume's doctrine is on this showing also a skeptical one, in the pointed sense to be defined in chapter VR. 27 Analogous objections against remaining psychological interpretations of our logical principle. Ambiguities as sources of delusion. It is easy to see that objections like those raised in our last section must touch every psychological misinterpretation of the so-called laws of thought, and all laws which depend on them. There is no route of escape from the demand for definition and proof by an appeal to the self-confidence of reason, or to the self-evidence which these laws have in logical thinking. Our insight into the logical laws is assured. But insofar as their doubt content is seen as psychological, their original sense, to which our insight into them attaches, has been wholly altered. Exact laws have, as we saw, been turned into vague, empirical generalities. If their range of indefiniteness is duly noted, they may claim validity, but they are quite removed from self-evidence. Following their natural thought trends, though without a clear consciousness of them, psychological theorists of knowledge no doubt at first understand the laws in question in an objective sense, before, that is, their arts of philosophical interpretation are brought into play. They then make the mistake of thinking that they can appeal to the self-evidence attaching to the properly interpreted formulae, a self-evidence guaranteeing their absolute validity, even when subsequent reflection has imposed wholly new senses on the logical formulae in question. If there is any case where one can justifiably speak of an insight through which truth itself is directly perceived, the statement that of two contradictory statements not both are true is a case in point, but, if we are to deny justification to such talk, we may plainly do so in regard to all psychologizing reinterpretations of the same, or of its equivalents, for example that affirmation and negation exclude one another in our thought, that judgments recognized to be contradictory cannot coexist in a single consciousness. 6. That it is impossible for us to believe an explicit contradiction. 7. That no one can take something to be and not to be at the same time, and so forth. Let us dwell for a while, to leave no residual unclarity, on all these shimmering wordings. Regarded more closely, they at once reveal the misleading influence of ambiguities, as a result of which the true law, or its equivalent normative transformation, is confused with psychological assertions. Affirmation and denial exclude one another in thought. The term thought, which in its wider sense covers all intellectual activities, is in the usage of certain logicians by preference applied to rational, logical thought, to correct judgment. That incorrect judgment, yes and no exclude one another, is plain, but this is merely an equivalent of the logical law, and not at all a psychological proposition. It tells us that no judgment is correct in which the same state of affairs is at once affirmed and denied. It says nothing regarding a possible coexistence of contradictory acts of judgment, whether in one consciousness, or in several. Even Hoefler and Maimond's logic, 1890, p. 133, inadvertently substitutes the thought of non-coexistence for our logical principle. The second formula, that judgments recognized as contradictory cannot coexist in a single consciousness, is likewise excluded if consciousness is interpreted as consciousness as such, as a timeless, normal consciousness. A primitive logical principle can of course not presuppose a notion like normality, since this cannot even be formulated without regard to such a principle. It is plain, further, that if our proposition is thus misunderstood, and is kept free from all metaphysical hypostatization, it is merely an equivalent rewriting of our logical principle, and has nothing whatever to do with psychology. An ambiguity similar to that in our first formulation occurs in our third and fourth. No one can believe in a contradiction, no one can take something both to be and not to be, no one, that is, who is rational, to add an obvious qualification. The impossibility concerns anyone who wishes to judge rightly and no one else. It does not therefore express a psychological compulsion, but our insight that contradictory propositions are not both true, that the states of affairs corresponding to them cannot both coexist, so that, if anyone claims to judge rightly, i.e. to treat the true as the true, and the false as the false, he must judge as this law prescribes. Actual judgments may be quite different, no psychological law drives the judging subject under the yoke of logical laws. We therefore again have before us an equivalent restatement of the logical law, infinitely far from the thought of psychological laws which govern judgment phenomena. But this thought forms the essential kernel of the psychological interpretation. This last arises when cannot believe etc. is taken to mean a non-coexistence of judgments instead of the incompatibility of the corresponding propositions, i.e. a necessary non-realization of their joint truth. The proposition, no reasonable, or merely responsible, individual can believe a contradiction, permits of yet another interpretation. We call a man reasonable, if we credit him with an habitual tendency to judge rightly, in his own sphere, of course, and in a normal frame of mind. A man regularly capable, when normal, of hitting off the obvious, what lies to hand, is a responsible thinker in the sense here in question. The avoidance of explicit contradiction is naturally included in the, quite vague, range of the obvious. If we carry out this subsumption, the statement no responsible, reasonable person can believe in contradictions, does no more than trivially apply a general principle to a particular case. We should of course not call a thinker responsible, if the case were otherwise. Here again there is no reference to a psychological law. But we have not reached the end of possible interpretations. There is a grave ambiguity in the word impossibility, which not only points to a union excluded by objective law, but also to a subjective incapacity to unify factors. This ambiguity serves to reinforce our psychologistic tendencies. I cannot believe that contradictories coexist, try as hard as I will, my attempt shivers itself upon an unconquerable, felt resistance. This incapacity for belief is arguably an inwardly evident experience. I see belief in contradictories to be impossible for me, as for any being that I must think of by analogy with myself. I therefore have evident insight into a psychological law of which the principle of contradiction is the expression. To limit ourselves to the new errors in this argument, we may answer as follows. Experience shows that, once we have passed judgment on an issue, the attempt to give up the conviction now flooding us, and to embrace some opposed alternative, is vain. Even if new thought motives come up, retrospective doubts arise, old convictions at variance with our present ones haunt us, we are often assailed by an obscure feeling of upsurging, embattled thought masses. The vain attempt, the felt resistance etc. are individual experiences, limited as to person and time, bound up with definite, if not exactly specifiable circumstances. How could they provide inner evidence for a universal law which transcends persons and times? One ought not to confuse the assertoric inner evidence for the existence of a single experience, with the apodeictic inner evidence for the holding of a general law. Can the evidence for the existence of a feeling which we interpreted as one of incapacity, provide the insight that what we now in fact do not bring off will be forever denied us by law? One should note how impossible it is to specify the circumstances which play so essential a role in the situation. Often enough we make mistakes on the matter, though deep conviction as to the reality of a factor pushes us to say, it is unthinkable that anyone should judge not A. It is in this same sense that we are able to say, it is unthinkable that anyone should not accept the law of contradiction, of which we are most firmly convinced, or no one can manage to believe in two contradictory propositions at the same time. It may be that multiplied testing by examples has engendered a lively empirical judgment to this effect, but the inner evidence that this always and necessarily happens we do not possess at all. The true situation can be set forth thus. We have apodeictic inner evidence, insight in the pointed sense, in regard to the not both being true of contradictory propositions or the not both being the case of opposed states of affairs. This law of incompatibility is the true principle of contradiction. Apodeictic inner evidence then extends itself to a useful psychological application. We can also see that two judgments of contradictory content, both merely setting forth in judgment what their intuitive foundations offer, cannot coexist. We can also see that pairs of contradictory judgments having either assertoric inner evidence, or apodeictic inner evidence, can coexist neither in a single consciousness, nor dispersed among several consciousnesses. All this merely tells us that states of affairs which, as contradictory, are objectively incompatible, can also in fact never be thought together in the sphere of anyone's intuition or insight, which does not at all mean that he cannot hold them to be coexistent. We have, on the other hand, no apodeictic inner evidence in regard to contradictory judgments in general. We only empirically know that, within the limits of practically familiar classes of cases, sufficiently defined for practical purposes, contradictory acts of judgment in fact exclude one another. 28. The supposed two-sidedness of the principle of contradiction, in virtue of which it should be taken both as a natural law of thinking, and as a normal law for its logical regulation in our psychologically obsessed age. Few logicians have been quite able to steer clear of psychological misinterpretations of logical principles, even if they have stood out against attempts to found logic on psychology, and even if they would, on other grounds, resent the charge of psychologism. What is not psychological is not accessible to psychological illumination, and each well-meant attempt to use psychological researches to throw light on the essence of laws of thinking, presupposes a psychological reinterpretation of those laws. If one reflects on these truths, one will have to count all German logicians who have followed the lead of Sigwart among such psychological reinterpreters, even if they have been far from expressly formulating, or characterizing, logical laws as psychological, and even if they have strongly opposed them to other psychological laws. If such conceptual shifts are not expressed in the chosen formulations of the laws, they more certainly appear in the accompanying elucidations, or in the whole expository context. Very remarkable attempts have been made to give the principle of contradiction a double status, in virtue of which it is, on the one hand, a natural law which determines our actual judging, while, on the other hand, it is a normal law, serving as a foundation to all logical rules. This conception is most attractively presented by F. A Lang in his Logikstudien, a brilliant work whose aim is not to contribute to a psychologistic logic alarm mill, but to lay new foundations for formal logic. But if one looks more closely at these new foundations, one reads that the truths of logic, like those of mathematics, derive from our intuition of space, opposite. 1877, p. 130, and that, since the simple foundations of these sciences guarantee the strict correctness of all knowledge whatsoever, they are the foundations of our intellectual organization, and that the lawfulness we admire in them, springs from ourselves. From our own unconscious foundations, opposite p. 148. When we read this, we cannot fail to classify Lang's view as a psychologism, even if of another sort, to which Kant's formal idealism, on the prevailing interpretation, as well as all other forms of the doctrine of innate faculties and innate sources of knowledge, belong. 8. Lang writes on this point as follows: the law of contradiction is the point at which the natural laws of thought come into touch with the normative laws. The ever-active psychological conditions of our idea formation bring forth truth and error in ever-burgeoning abundance in our natural, unregulated thinking, but they are supplemented, restricted, and employed towards a definite end, by the fact that we cannot combine contradictory elements in our thought, when once they have been made, as it were, to coincide. The mind swallows the grossest contradictions as long as the contradictory elements can be kept apart in different thought compartments. Only when a statement and its contradictory relate to the same object, do we lose our power to combine them. We either become quite unsure of ourselves or one of the two assertions has to yield. Psychologically, such an elimination of contradiction may be temporary, since the immediate coincidence of the contradictions is temporary. What has deep roots in different departments of thought cannot simply be destroyed, if mere inferences have shown it to be contradictory. At the point where the consequences of the two propositions are brought to immediate coincidence, this result certainly follows, but it does not filter back through the whole deductive chain to the seat of the original conflict. Doubt as to the validity of this deductive chain or as to the identity of its object often serve to protect error. And even when such error is disturbed for the moment, it springs once more from the familiar round of associated ideas, and lives on for as long as repeated assaults do not finally lay it low. Despite this toughness of error, the psychological law which rules out the union of immediate contradictions must continue to exert great influence on our thought. It is the sharp edge by which, in the course of experience, untenable combinations of ideas are destroyed while the more tenable combinations survive. It is the destructive principle in the natural progress of human thought, which, like the progress of organisms, depends on the fact that ever new combinations of ideas are being produced, of which the main mass are continually destroyed, while the better ones survive and have further effects. This psychological law of contradiction is given immediately by our organism, and operates prior to all experience, as a condition of all experience. Its mode of action is objective, and it need not first be brought to consciousness in order to act. If we now wish to conceive of the same law as the foundation of logic, if we wish to acknowledge it as the normative law of all thought, as it also has been operative as a law of nature without our acknowledgement, then we certainly have need of typical intuitions to convince us, as in the case of all other axioms. Opposite p. 27f, what is the essential element in logic, when all psychological additions have been stripped away? Only the fact of the continual removal of contradictories. It is a mere pleonasm in our intuitively based schema if one denies that contradiction can exist, as if there were yet another necessity behind the ground of the necessary. The fact is that a contradiction does not exist, that each judgment which oversteps the limits of this notion, is at once superseded by an opposed, better founded judgment. But this factual supersession is for logic the ultimate ground of all rules. Psychologically regarded, it can itself again be called necessary, in that it is seen as a special case of a more general law of nature. With this, however, logic has nothing to do, since it originates at the same point as its law of contradiction. Opposite p. 49, these doctrines of F. Lang have, in particular, had a plain influence on K. Kroman, Unser Naturkenntnis, Trans by Fischer-Benson, Copenhagen, 1883, and G. Heymans, Die Gesetz und Element des Wissenschaftlichen Denkens, Leipzig, 1890, 1894. To the latter we owe a systematic attempt to base epistemology on psychology in the most thoroughgoing manner. As an almost pure thought experiment it must be warmly welcomed, we shall have occasion to go into it more fully. Similar notions have been expressed by Zero. Liebman, Gedanken und Tatsachen, Volume Y, 1882, pp. 25-7, to our surprise in the course of a discussion which quite correctly attributes to logical necessity and absolute validity for every rational, thinking being, whether or not the rest of his constitution agrees with ours or not. It is plain from the above what our objections to these doctrines are. We do not deny the psychological facts mentioned in Lang's penetrating exposition, but we find nothing to justify talk of a law of nature. If we compare the various formulations of the supposed law with the facts, they reveal themselves as very careless expressions of the latter. If Lang had tried to describe and delimit these familiar experiences in an exact conceptual manner, he must have seen that they could not qualify as particular instances of an exact law, in the sense in which logical principles are such laws. What we have before us as a natural law of contradiction is, in fact, a rough, empirical generalization, which suffers from a quite unspecifiable degree of indefiniteness. It relates, moreover, merely to normal individual minds, for how abnormal minds behave is something on which the everyday experience here adduced has nothing to tell us. We miss, in short, the strictly scientific attitude, which is quite indispensable if pre-scientific judgments of experience are to be used for scientific purposes. We protest vigorously against the mixing up of a vague empirical generalization with an absolutely exact, purely conceptual law, which has its place in logic alone. We think it absurd to identify the one with the other, or to deduce the one from the other, or to weld both into the supposedly two-sided law of contradiction. Only sheer ignoring of the plain content of the logical law could permit us to ignore the further fact that this content is not at all relevant, directly or indirectly, to the actual elimination of contradiction in thought. This actual elimination plainly only concerns the judgment experienced by one and the same individual in one and the same time and act. It does not concern affirmation if divided among different individuals and in different times and acts. For the factual element here relevant such distinctions are essential, but they do not affect the logical law at all. For this says nothing concerning the conflict among contradictory judgments, among real, dated acts of this or that character, it only speaks of the law-based incompatibility of the timeless ideal unities we call contradictory propositions. The truth that the members of such a pair of propositions are not both true, contains no shadow of an empirical assertion about any consciousness and its acts of judgment. I think that one has only to make this quite clear to oneself, and take it seriously, to see the wrongness of the whole notion that we are now criticizing. 29. Continuation. Sigwardt's doctrine. Eminent thinkers before Lang have inclined to this disputed attribution of a double character to the basic laws of logic. Even Bergman, Reiner Logic, end of 2, otherwise little disposed to make concessions to psychologism, does so in one chance remark, but Sigwart above all is guilty. His wide influence over modern logic justifies a narrower discussion of the relevant passages. On the view of this important logician, the principle of contradiction is a normative law in no other sense than it is a natural law, a law which simply establishes the meaning of negation. As a natural law, it merely says that it is impossible consciously to affirm that A is B and that A is not B at a given moment, but as a normative law it is applied to the whole range of standing concepts to which the unity of consciousness extends. Seen in this regard, it underlies the principle of contradiction ordinarily so called, which is not, however, to be coordinated with the law of identity, in the sense of the formula ISO, since it presupposes the fulfillment of this law, i.e. the absolute constancy of our concepts. Sigwart, Logic, 12, p. 358, 45-5. Parallel things are said in the statements regarding the law of identity, interpreted as a principle of agreement. The difference between the principle of agreement treated as a natural and a normative law, does not lie in its own nature, but in the presupposition of its application. In the former case it is applied to what is present to consciousness, in the latter case to the ideal state of a persistent, unchanging presence of all ordered, presentative content to a single consciousness, a state which is empirically incapable of complete fulfillment. Sigwart, Logic, 12, p. 383, 45-2. To this we object, how can a proposition which, as law of contradiction, establishes the meaning of negation, have the character of a law of nature? Sigwart of course does not mean that the law is a nominal definition which lays down the sense of the word negation, but only that it is rooted in the sense of negation, that it sets forth what pertains to the concept's meaning. Sigwart in other words only wants to say that to give up the law is to give up the meaning of negation. This, however, can never make up the doubt content of a law of nature, and, in particular, not of that law which Sigwart formulates in the following words. It is impossible consciously to affirm that A is bad, that A is not at a given moment. Propositions whose roots lie in concepts, not mere applications of such conceptually rooted propositions to facts, can say nothing as to what we can or cannot consciously do at a given moment. If, as Sigwart elsewhere teaches, they are timeless, there can be nothing in their essential content which concerns the temporal, and which therefore concerns the factual. To drag facts into propositions of this sort is always to destroy their genuine sense. All this makes it clear that the natural law which concerns matters in time, and the normative law, the true principle of contradiction, that concerns timeless matters, differ completely in kind, and that we cannot accordingly be dealing with a single law which, with unchanged sense merely functions differently or has a different sphere of application. If the disputed view were correct, there should further be a general formula concerning both the law concerning facts and the law concerning ideal objects. A man who believes in a single law here must have a single, definite conception of it. We see, however, that it is quite vain to ask for this unitary conception. To this objection I shall add another. The normative law of contradiction is thought to presuppose absolute constancy among our concepts. The law would then only hold on condition that we always used expressions with the same meaning, and where this condition was not fulfilled, it would not hold. This cannot be what the famous logician seriously believes. The empirical application of the law certainly presupposes that the concepts or propositions which function as the meanings of our expressions really are the same, since the law ideally extends to all possible pairs of propositions of opposed quality but identical subject matter. But this of course is no condition of the law's validity, as if this were merely hypothetical, but conditions the possible application of the law to previously given instances. Just as it is a precondition for applying a numerical law, that we have, in a given case, numbers actually before us, and numbers of such a character as the law expressly refers to, so it is a precondition for applying the logical law of contradiction that propositions are before us, that they are propositions of identical subject matter is also expressly stipulated. It does not seem to me helpful, furthermore, to relate the law to the consciousness in general sketched by Sigwart. In such a concept all concepts, more exactly all expressions, would be used with absolutely identical meanings, there would be no flux of meanings, no ambiguities or quaternions terminorum. The laws of logic have, however, no intrinsic, essential relation to this ideal, which we rather construct to fit them. The constant reference to an ideal consciousness makes us feel disagreeably that the logical laws perhaps only strictly hold for fictitious ideal cases, and not for such as we encounter in experience. The sense in which the laws of pure logic presuppose identity of concepts has just been discussed. If our conceptions are in flux, if the same expression recurs with an altered content, we no longer have the same concept in the sense of logic, but a second one, and a new one for each further alteration. But each single concept is in itself a supreme empirical unity, and falls under the logical rules which apply to its form. As the flux of empirical color contents and the imperfect identification of qualities do not affect color differentiations as species of qualities, as one species has ideal identity over against its manifold possible cases, which are not themselves colors, but instances of one color, so meanings or concepts have identity in relation to the conceptions of which they are the contents. Our capacity to ID universals in singulars, to have a seeing grasp of a concept in an empirical presentation, and to be assured of the identity of our conceptual intentions in repeated presentation, is presupposed by the possibility of knowledge. Just as, in the act of ideation, we intuitively lay hold of one concept, as the single species, whose unity over against actual instances, or instances thought of as actual, is given with insight, so we can apprehend the inward evidence of the logical laws as relating to concepts formed in this or that manner. Among concepts, in the sense of ideal unities, are also to be found the propositions of which the principle of contradiction speaks, and so also the meanings of the algebraic signs used in the formal expression of logical principles. Wherever acts of conceptual presentation are carried out, we encounter concepts, our presentations have their contents, their ideal meanings, which we can lay hold of abstractively, in ideational abstraction, and this means that we can apply logical laws everywhere. The validity of these laws is, however, absolutely unrestricted, nor does it depend on our power, nor on anyone's power, to achieve acts of conceptual presentation, nor to sustain or repeat such acts in the consciousness that they have the same intention.